This is Algebra 2, Unit 11, Lesson 4. The rest of the notes on the definition of the sine and cosine functions. Okay, so from the Ed Puzzle previously, we ended up on exercise 6, so let's work on that. All right, so we were talking about the Pythagorean identity. The Pythagorean identity falls in the unit circle, which it basically says, by the Pythagorean theorem, cosine theta squared, remember cosine is the x, and sine theta squared, sine is the y, must equal 1 for the unit circle. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to use that to figure out the value of sine theta in simplest radical form in the quadrant. So an angle theta has a terminal ray that falls in the first quadrant, and cosine theta is equal to 1/3. Determine the value of sine theta in simplest radical form. So since the Pythagorean identity has to hold, we know that cosine theta squared plus sine theta squared has to equal 1 for the unit circle. So we know that cosine theta is 1/3. So that would go here. All right, and then we have sine theta squared here, and then add them together has to equal 1. All right, so we want to solve this for sine theta. All right, so we treat this like we normally do. 1/3 squared. 1 times 1 is 1. 3 times 3 is 9. So 1/3 squared is 1/9. All right, now to solve this for sine theta, we have to get the 1/9 to the other side, so we subtract 1/9. Now, when you do this, it's very important to leave the fractions. Most of the time, you've done in fraction answers. So when you do the fraction, you get sine theta quantity squared is equal to 1 minus 1/9 is 8/9. Okay, then you have to take the square root of both sides. Now remember, when you take the square root, that will cancel out the square, leaving just sine theta, but remember, it's also plus or minus the square root of 8/9. All right, now, it says in simplest radical form. All right, so we need to take the square root of both the top and the bottom. It's the square root of 8 over the square root of 9. Well, we know the square root of 9 is going to be 3. All right, now in simplest radical form, 8 breaks down into 4 times 2. So in simplest radical form, that's going to be 2 radical 2. All right, but remember, it's plus or minus 2 radical 2 over 3. So how do we decide whether we use the plus or the minus for the sign? Well, it depends on what quadrant you're in. We are in the first quadrant. So remembering for sine, A, S, T, C, remember the first quadrant is A, that means all positive, because both the x and the y coordinate, when you do the unit circle in this, will be positive in the first quadrant. So for in the first quadrant, sine would have to be positive. Sine theta would have to be 2 square root of 2 over 3, the positive value. Because it falls in the first quadrant, both the x and the y coordinate, which are cosine and sine, must be positive. So if you know your ASTC, you can use Pythagorean theorem to figure out either sine or cosine, and then you have to decide whether it's positive or negative, depending on what quadrant the terminal side of the angle falls in. Okay, so that's the end of the notes for today.